Hey everyone, welcome to This Week in People. I'm your host Lars Schmidt, and This Week in People, as always, is supported by my friends at PIN, the employee communications tool for the distributed workforce. So, as always, with each episode, all the links I'm about to walk you through are included in the show notes, so I encourage you to go ahead and click those when this wraps up and go a little deeper. Let's jump right in. The first article is a follow-up from a newsletter a couple weeks back on companies that were experimenting with a 4-day work week. In this case, it wasn't a company, it was a country. Iceland actually piloted a 4-day work week and reduced hours to 1% of their workforce, and they scaled that across different industries. And that once they collected data from that, they found that it was so successful that they are now scaling that in many roles and companies and industries within the country. So they found that it had no negative impact on productivity and definitely an increase in well-being and mental health and wellness. So interesting to see. I think we're in the early days of companies beginning to look at 4-day work weeks, but interesting to see, how countries like Iceland and Japan experimented with this as well. If we begin to see more of this in the next couple of years, we'll see. But I expect with the increase in flexibility, we will be seeing more of this. The next piece I want to walk you through is a really great guide to hybrid work from Adam Nathan and the team over at Almanac. They've been on fire creating lots of open source guides and resources supporting remote and distributed and hybrid work, and this guide is no exception. So lots of great practical tips on how to design a thoughtful hybrid workplace and some considerations along the way. So this is a really interesting article from The Economist about the difficulty companies have beginning to kind of map out their return to workplace plans, and in some cases being more difficult than shifting to remote. I think we shifted to remote. That wasn't really an option. That was a requirement. It was a mandate. Everybody had to do the same thing in different regions as cities and different areas locked down. Returning is a different situation, and once it's deemed safe to do so, doesn't mean that every company is going to revert back to their previous ways, and many of them won't. And so this article gets into some of the challenges that presents, in particular when you think about the environment we're in right now, where hiring is on fire almost everywhere, yet for companies that haven't made commitments around what their workplace will be, whether it'll be hybrid, distributed, flexible, co-located, whatever it might be, that's a concern for employees. And so companies are offering all kinds of different perks and salary increases and bonuses to try to offset that. But that's something that is becoming a real challenge with hiring, is that candidates want to know definitively, like, what is your structure going to be in 6 months, 12 months, and beyond. And not all companies have those answers yet. And so that can be a limiting factor when you're competing for especially highly in demand and sought after talent in this market. On that note, Uber actually came out, their chief people officer penned an update to their hybrid work policy, really with an emphasis on flexibility. And I think that they are smart in the way they're approaching this, where they're coming out with a set of guidelines and approaches, but they're iterating on that based on employee feedback. And so they set up an initial structure where they expected employees to be in an office 3 days a week. Employees, raised concerns about that, wanted a bit more flexibility. And so now they've adapted that a few months later to be 50% of your time should be in an office. And you can figure out when that is. And so there's other degrees of flexibility, but I expect we'll see more of this as companies roll out a plan and then get feedback from their employees around how they're taking advantage of that plan, concerns with it, issues, etc. I think being flexible and continually kind of iterating and recalibrating based on employee feedback is really important as we navigate and design our return to workplace plans. This is another really good article from the founder and CEO of Quartz. They're based in New York. He penned a post on their blog that got picked up elsewhere that talked about what their experience has been like since they've reopened their office. So employees are not required to go back in office. It's entirely optional. They're fully remote, but they do have a space. They had a lease committed to in New York, which is no cheap thing to do. And so when it was safe to do so, they opened it back up and they gave employees the options about coming back. But he gave a real kind of tangible feedback on what they've experienced since they've opened, including things like mandating vaccines, which for them has been a non-issue, to really creating actually a guide on how they're returning back into the office. And this guide actually in the Yahoo post that you can get to in the links at the show here actually includes a PDF version that you can download and update and customize and use yourself. So a really valuable takeaway from him, and that piece is useful. But they get into things like, hoteling and hot desking, and the fact that, to have a hybrid office and have real estate that's open, you really, to maintain social distancing and all the things that are required, you have to have kind of open desks. And so, from a safety perspective, it's a requirement, but they also, aren't necessarily, some employees are frustrated by that they don't have their dedicated space. And so he really gets into all the different nuances of the impact of going back to an office. So definitely worth your time, especially for those of you that are still designing your programs. This is a really interesting article on network analysis from MIT Sloan. I definitely recommend you check this out. It gets into using network analysis to really understand the dynamics of who, how, what, and when about returning to an office and the workplace. And so some interesting stats here, getting into, they did network analysis on different roles and functions and the necessity of them based on their work in different industries to actually be able to be productive doing that work in an office or remotely. And they get into how the value of live in-person meetings versus distributed meetings, which I thought was really interesting. It kind of tells you, like, if you're going to be getting on site, here's the main value you're going to get from that. If you're doing these other things, there's really no value add to doing that live and in person. And it also touches on, I think, a really important part as we design our return to work plans. Top performers tend to have a preference to be remote or flexible or hybrid. And there's lots of data to begin backing this up. But I think is we're designing and thinking about our return to workplace plans, those are the people that are going to be the hardest to hire. Those are the people that are going to be the hardest to retain. Obviously, we need to think across our entire populations. But if we are not kind of prioritizing those really difficult to fill and find positions and keep positions in our plans, there's a good chance that we might be designing something that will maybe be more broadly relevant across our employee population, but might make it difficult to hire and retain people in those really in-demand positions. So definitely something for you to be thinking about. And lastly, big weekend coming up. Is it coming home? Is it going back to Italy? I don't know, but I'll be watching. And for those of you watching who are backers of either country, I just hope you have a great game. And it's been an interesting cup so far. And we'll see what the outcome is. So hopefully one of your populations will be very happy, and we'll see who on Sunday. So that's a wrap for this week's People. I will be back next week. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I'll see you soon.